Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many new and familiar faces, and exciting to have so many folks joining us on Zoom. Can people on Zoom hear us okay? Maybe give a, Rosie, can you see if anyone's giving a thumbs up?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks for confirming. So wonderful. Yeah, so I want to welcome everyone to our FLUXNet methane version 2.0 workshop. So this, I'll go sort of through the history of how this came about. So this is funded by a FLUXNet coordination project grant. So we'd like to thank FLUXNet for this. So it brings together folks in person here at Berkeley and our participants on Zoom as well. So the workshop is designed to help Flux PIs, researchers, and students, primarily with Flux data QC, QA, provide code that can help format data to base in formats. I know, firsthand how data wrangling can be somewhat of a challenge. And, we don't always have the time or the personnel to do this. So a lot of this stems from trying to help facilitate some of these steps and make it more accessible to folks. Of course, it's just one way of doing it. This is the way that we've been working on in my group. But hopefully that this is an additional tool that people can use as they work towards formatting their data and contributing to some new activities such as FLUXNet methane, as well as the new FLUXNet initiative. And so the goals of the workshop for today, so we're going to provide an overview of FLUXNet methane version 2, and as well as the FLUXNet data system. So both of these activities are coming online this year, and we're hoping for some data releases next year. So the goal again is to having small technical difficulties here. Oh. Pages. Okay. So we're going to provide tutorials and code to help facilitate the inclusion of new or existing sites into FLUXNet methane and into the FLUXNet data system initiative. So again, I know that many people already have their own ways of doing that. There's multiple approaches that have been developed by numerous groups across the globe for this. But this is just one approach that we've been developing and are providing as an opportunity or as a resource for either new Flux PIs or PIs, maybe looking to learn some new approaches. It's also designed to help facilitate the inclusion of methane into OneFlux. So I'll talk about this in a second, but we know that the OneFlux pipeline does not include methane fluxes. But we really want to try to merge these efforts rather than have two separate efforts. The goal is to sort of work together and bring together these two parallel initiatives. And we also want to foster existing and new international community collaborations and bring together folks in the Flux community. So we have some people here in person. This is a great opportunity to chat and mingle and come up with new and exciting ideas. But we're also going to have a breakout session tomorrow where folks can meet in a Zoom chat room and talk about different collaborations, maybe get to meet other people, share some of what you're doing, and maybe have some collaborations grow from this workshop as well. So just a few notes on the workshop. So again, if you're joining us either in person or online, you don't need to attend the full workshop. We're going to be offering 3 data tutorials, and they're all going to be designed to be the same. So the beginning, we're going to have just sort of an overview of the tutorial. You can see if you're interested in it, if it fits your needs. And then we're going to offer some breakout sessions where we can help walk you through the tools that we've developed. And we're going to have a number of breakout sessions and folks who we've been working with that can help people walk through this tutorial. So it's really designed, again, to sort of bring your data into a database format, do some cleaning, and also some visualization tools as well. The workshop's going to be recorded. I know we're spanning the globe. These time zones don't always work for everyone, but do note that they will be recorded. Probably by the end of the week, the recordings will be up on the web page for the workshop. And again, I'll provide all of this in an email afterwards. So slides and instructions for the data tutorials can be found on that link. It's also in the workshop agenda and it's also online. Maybe Rosie, you could put some of those links in the chat so that folks can have them as well, but they're also available on the agenda for the workshop as well. Also, we're going to be playing with some data, the fun part of this. What we have is very versatile, but it works most smoothly if you have sort of standard Campbell files or Lightwork files, so EduPro or SmartFlux files. If you have something beyond that, we can certainly handle it, but it helps for us to see that data ahead of time. So there's a link also on the website and on the agenda where you can go and upload a small sample of your data. So it could be just 1 day of data or 2 days of data, but anything less than 10 megabytes. And that can just help us make sure that we can ingest it into the data pipeline and reduce any sort of obstacles right from the get-go. Okay, so that was the introduction. Next, we're going to hear from Rob Jackson, who's going to, oops, sorry, those are my slides for the next talk. I will pull up Rob's slides. And we're going to talk about why we're moving forward with this next release of the FLUXNet methane database.
Let's see it. Let's get a lower from the back here. Hi everyone, I'm Rob Jackson. Nice to see you all, and thanks to Sara and Kyle in particular and many others for setting all this up. And it's nice to see people in person as well as all of you online. Well, I'm standing right in front of you. Okay. So I want to provide a little bit of context for how this effort began and where we're going, what we see as some of the needs in the work. And part of the reason for getting together is to help with data wrangling, but it's always to gather people's ideas for what you think are important research questions. I'll introduce or start with the Global Carbon Project, in this case, the Global Methane Budget. This is work led by Marielle Sonnois in France. We just came out with a new budget, and it's hard to see from there. Most of you have likely seen this before. The orange arrows on the left are anthropogenic sources. That's a fossil arrow on the left, about 125 million tons a year of methane. The agricultural arrow is about 200 million tons. There's a little bit of the wildfires, the narrow one. And this one here, get point online, the large hatched arrow is the one I want to focus on today. That's our estimate of wetland and freshwater emissions. So that's the largest natural source. But this is the first budget that we've tried to break down freshwater and wetlands into sort of natural and anthropogenic. And we haven't done that in the past. We treated all of these emissions as natural. And the most obvious exception to that are dams and reservoirs. If a dam is built and a new reservoir is there, that's not so different from the landfill. It's something that simply wasn't present before, and it has methane emissions. But we're doing more than that to our wetlands and freshwater systems. We're warming them, which boosts microbial activity. All else being equal, we're adding nutrients to them through eutrophication and other things. So one of the things we're struggling with in the Global Carbon Project is how to divide those influences up into what sort of the natural emission would be without human influence. And so that's a current research effort. And that's why that large bar is hatched. Anyone who has questions, feel free to jump in person or online. How do I do that? Okay. I wanted to spend just a minute on how the FLUXNet methane effort began. This was a MORE grant that we wrote to try and support different research questions for the global methane budget. These are 5 of them. I don't know if you can see them in back. Constraining rates of destruction by hydroxyl radicals, quantifying methane sources from freshwater systems, specifically to establish a FLUXNet methane activity, which we did in the first MORE grant, and then to look at high latitude systems in particular as a vulnerable system, and then to do a better job of differentiating thermogenic methane from sort of natural geologic seeps and from anthropogenic oil and gas energy related systems. So we established FLUXNet methane as part of this. You see Sara Gavin and ATM were some of the first folks who came on board to help us do this, and they've been leading many of these efforts since then. So that's where this began, and I'll try and be brief. So we established this effort with about 80 sites initially, and others of you here, like Ben, have been here from the beginning. We didn't establish these towers, obviously. These were investigators in place, and this is an effort to aggregate those data, make them accessible, gap fill them in a consistent way, and things like that. You see the map down at the bottom, and I'll come back to this as we kind of hone in the tropics for current efforts. So there are a couple of summary papers. Sara led one, Kyle led one. We've had many others. It's been a very collaborative and I think fair to say a successful effort. We had, I think, more than a dozen group papers out of the first PAL workshop and other things that we led specifically around FLUXNet methane. So people put a lot of work into it, but got a lot out of it, I think is fair to say. And this is the kind of results you can get. This is a figure, really small, sorry for you in the back. Methane emissions on the y-axis, and then temperature. I don't even remember if that's surface temperature or soil temperature, but in any event, you see a very steep rise in methane emissions with increasing temperatures. But that's not warming a site, that's substituting space for time. So each of those dots is a different location on Earth. But consistent with our expectations, methane emissions appear to go up. Well, they don't appear, they do go up for systems in warmer areas. The map, again, you see mostly temperate, a fair number of boreal systems in Europe and Alaska and Canada, at least. Almost nothing, literally, in the tropics at the time of this first this database assemblage. What do I do wrong? And then, just as a reminder, why we're sort of reorienting a bit towards the tropics. The northern latitudes are extremely important, and as you all know, there's, depending on what number you use, half an atmosphere's worth of peat carbon locked away up there as permafrost. Peat, so if and when that thaws, goes to the atmosphere, it's bad news no matter what. It's really bad if it goes as carbon dioxide. It's terrible if it goes as methane. But when you look at global emissions for methane, just as a reminder, I have to remind myself sometimes, a 10% increase in the tropics would be equivalent approximately to a doubling of emissions in Arctic systems. And we think there's good reasons to believe that tropical emissions are increasing today. And we don't have the measurement background to really know what they are on the ground well, or to have enough of the baseline to say with confidence that they are increasing today. So that's really one of the emphases of this current effort. And you see this blue wedge here in the tropics is ag and waste, and the green wedge is the tropical wetland piece of the pie. So it's a major piece of global methane emissions. This was a paper that Ewan Nisbet wrote. Ewan's at Royal Holloway in London. Rising methane is warming, feeding warming. The idea that the sort of permafrost methane carbon link isn't the only system that's vulnerable and that we need to be worried about. So Ewan's been a strong advocate that this has already begun in Africa, for instance, this Congo acceleration of emissions. Shuiying Yu in our group, we published this paper just a couple of months ago. This is just one satellite. This is based on Tripoli, but Shuiying looked at changes in the last 4 years, so 2019 to 2023. And I have no idea what you can see if you're not on Zoom, but there are brown as an increase in emissions over that 4-year period. Blue is a decrease. So there's almost exclusively increases on this. There's one brown wedge or rectangle near Beijing in China, which we think is energy related. But everything else that shows an increase in the last few years by this satellite is along the tropics and mostly wetlands. You see the Congo most prominently right in the middle. You see the Western Amazon with a little bit less confidence. And then you see an area down by the Pantanal in more southern Brazil. And then you see some yellow across other areas of Africa, South America, and into Southeast Asia too. So one more piece of evidence that there's something happening, we think, in the tropics already. Maybe that's a result of the El Nino, and things will go back to normal, but we just don't know yet. Dan Jacobs' lab had a PNAS paper a month or two ago suggesting the same thing for the Congo between 20 and 2022. Okay, Sarah, I don't know why I'm helpless on this, because all right, so I mentioned our first MORE grant in support of the budget set up the FLUXNet methane effort, and now in our current grant, we're really focusing in on the tropics, South America in particular, some reestablished sites in the Okavango, and a lot of gaps still to be filled elsewhere around the world. And blue is FLUXNet V1, gray are sites that we think have methane flux towers but aren't in the network yet, and that we'd like to bring in to the network, and red are new or newly established sites. That's a picture of Ian Santos Fleischmann down in Miroa in Brazil. And then I'll stop here in just a second. This is FA's map of the current status of the FLUXNet, what we think will be V2, 2.0. So again, blue is already in the database. Many of these sites will be contributing additional site years data. And red are new sites, not just that we're setting up down in South America, but across the world, other people that are bringing towers online, making their data available. So there's a lot happening, and we stand to have a much better representation in the tropics if we can pull this off, which I think we can. So thanks to, I need a tutorial on advancing this computer. And I'll stop here. Just one final thought is that to acknowledge that the flux data are critically important, and we need them to have a baseline, but we need a lot more than just the fluxes from our towers. So this is a slide. The orange and green is this Pete Raymond and Pierre Renier's work, breaking down the freshwater and wetland emissions into anthropogenic and natural sources. But we also are working on defining the global extent of wetlands and freshwater systems more. So we need that sort of the activity factor as well as the emission rate to make a good prediction. So we have to think about more than the flux rates. And I think I'll just stop there. So thanks, Sarah.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Rob, for that overview. Right, so that was sort of an overview for the need for FLUXNet methane version 2, and we're really excited to be working on that with the community, the Flux community this year. Now, Trevor will say a few words.
You could stop sharing screen.
Yep. Can you just share your Zoom?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. I see. Okay, there you go. Okay.
I'm sharing. Oh, let me do it here. Yeah, there we go.
Screen. Sorry, folks.
I think it's because your computer, it's showing what's on your computer, not what's on Zoom on there.
Yeah, I can see on Zoom.
Oh, I see.
Oh,
Right, because it's showing. Can I just?
I think you could just drag your Zoom window over to. If you just take your Zoom window over to there.
Oh, I see.
yeah,
That's
message here.
Yeah.
That's yeah. Keep dragging over.
Yeah. Drag those. think that.
Oh, I
today.
see.
Yeah.
Close the site.
All right, thanks, Trevor.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Excited to be here. I'm really excited about this initiative. It's super cool that the community is coming together in this way to support the FLUXNet methane efforts. And we're excited from the FLUXNet coordination project to support the workshop too. So I'm going to talk about FLUXNet. You may have heard of it. I'm going to be relatively brief, therefore, because I'm sure you all have a lot of background on what it is, but I'm going to talk a lot about the FLUXNet data initiative and where we're at and where we can harmonize together and explore, obviously, the many, many synergies that we have together. So as you know, or should know, FLUXNet is an international network of networks. So we like to say there is no FLUXNet, but FLUXNet, when you put all the pieces together, is a community of the willing who is really focused on developing eddy-covariant science and doing so in collaboration together to make the sum of the parts greater than the whole's greater than the sum of the parts. So we have many different networks around the world as part of FLUXNet, and that are all working together to build better eddy-covariance and flux science. So a brief history of FLUXNet started around 1905 or so, which was really just a group of people getting together and saying, hey, we all do flux research in different countries, and mostly in the US and Europe at that point. Let's collaborate and form a network. We'll call it FLUXNet. We've no support financially, so we're just going to work together and collaborate as much as possible to get stuff done. Because of that collaboration and the importance of the work that was being done, there was initially some NASA, some DOE support that helped to get off the ground. And then as it grew and grew and grew, there was some NSF or CN support, Research Coordination Network, a few years ago that was instrumental to the 2015 dataset release. And then DOE also provided some support. And these are pretty, like, not a lot of funds, just to employ somebody to help wrangle data or to support some workshops, etc. But had a huge impact as the community grew, and as you know, led to the release of the FLUXNet 2015 dataset, ultimately, which is now almost 10 years ago. So in 2019, we put together a proposal called FLUXNet 2025, the main objective of which was to build community support towards a FLUXNet 2025 data release on the 10-year anniversary of the FLUXNet 2015 data release. And that was funded by NSF, and we started in 2021. And since then, have been working together to build the community internationally. So this has been a really cool project to get involved with, because you really see how the willingness of people to collaborate internationally and get involved in something that's bigger than their individual research. So we kicked it off by, and I should mention that Kyle, who is here, is the deputy director over there. So if you have any questions, ask her as well. Kim Novik and Dave Moore, co-PIs. And this is the FLUXNet Community Council currently, which basically meets every month to advance topics in flux science. Those can be things like funding secondments of students from the US traveling abroad, funding workshops. So this workshop was submitted through a competitive application process, and the FLUXNet Community Council ultimately voted on the workshop proposals and selected this one to go ahead with funding for FLUXNet. So activities like that, but really ultimately it's about building collaborative spirit and community. That's our whole objective, because realizing that we can't do a data release, there's a lot of work without community buy-in, without the collaborative spirit and people knowing each other over many, many years and working together. So that's our whole objective. So the FLUXNet 2025 data initiative, I'm going to talk about mostly. I'm not going to talk about the FLUXNet co-op or the FCC work or anything like that, really. I'm going to focus on the data initiatives because that's why we're all here. So, briefly, sorry, that says previous model. Thank you. Like magic. And so I mentioned 2015 was the last time there was a data release from FLUXNet, the official FLUXNet data set that everybody has used extensively, thousands of publications. So the previous model was that all of the flux sites in the world would give their data effectively to one of two processing centers, Ameriflux and the European Fluxes database. And those two centers work together. It was mostly Hassan, who's sitting over here. I think you do a lot of the data wrangling work, but also many others. And to process that data to a common FluxNet standard, and using some code written in PV-Wave, which none of you've heard of. I had never heard of before. Somebody told me it was written in PV-Wave either, archaic. But and then process the data and put it in a harmonized data set. So this is a huge, huge amount of work because none of this data had been previously processed by a centralized group of any sort. It was some had been processed by individual PIs. And by process, I mean taking the half-hourly fluxes, gap filling the metadata, partitioning them, passing them through rigorous QA/QC, to get and propagating uncertainties, most importantly, perhaps, to get to a standardized data set. So it's a huge amount of work. So you may ask, okay, that happened in 2015. That was great, a massive resource used by everybody. Here we are, almost 10 years later, and the data set still ends at 2014. In fact, all the data in that data set. So why is that? Why hasn't it been updated? And the answer is it's a huge amount of work, especially when you're doing it through this model, which is highly centralized, based on data that has not previously been processed to any real degree. And that just amount of work that was almost completely unfunded, right? So there's a lot of goodwill, collaborative energy to get it done. Makes it very, very difficult to repeat. And there are lessons learned here that are important for the FluxNet methane group as well, in terms of how do we make this repeatable? How do we make it kind of a self-sustaining effort? So the self-sustaining effort that has been developed and in part implemented over the past few years is the shuttle concept, in which each of the regional networks is doing the work of processing their data and then surfacing it in a open access format, data portal. And then you have a master node, which is pulling data from those data sets on demand. So currently you go to the Flux website and all the data is there effectively, and you can search it and download it. And that's the FluxNet 2015 data set. The vision is that you go to a FluxNet website and there's actually no data there, but you can still explore the data. And that exploration is done through APIs to the regional network databases. And so when you identify what data you need, the APIs pull that data and you can download it directly from those regional networks. Right, so in this model is much more dynamic because it allows the regional networks to do the processing. It allows them to update their data dynamically, so you don't have to wait until all the data in the world is reprocessed again. If one network is processing their data, publishing it in their node data set, then you can pull from that data. So it becomes a dynamic living data set that's continuously updated. So this is very exciting, right? But it does depend on common shared tools and standards that each of the regional networks implements. And it also relies on each of regional networks, and we're using the term regional networks here without defining it, right? Ameriflux is a clear regional network, but there are lots of different regions that have networks at different levels of organization. But it relies on all of those networks collaborating to implement the same standards and techniques. So luckily, there's been a lot of work, particularly through Ameriflux and ICOS, on developing those standardized protocols. So the clearest example is OneFlux, which you've heard mentioned already today. So what is OneFlux? It is a processing pipeline that allows you to QA/QC, gap fill metadata, use that to gap fill the flux data, then partition the flux data into photosynthesis and respiration flux estimates, and then propagate the uncertainties through all of this. And there are lots of different steps involved in doing that, like use our threshold estimation. This is flux data for carbon, also water and energy. And ultimately, this becomes a standardized data product that if this code base, which is open source, you can go and download it from GitHub today and run it on your own data. If this is implemented exactly the same by all the different regional networks, then they're all producing this data to the same standard. That is kind of the gold standard. And if somebody else runs the code on the data set, should get the same answer, basically. So this work over the past few years has been fundamental in enabling this new model, because now we have a standardized data processing pipeline that any regional network or node of this shuttle concept can implement and use to develop the same gold standard data quality product. So it's a great vision. So where are we in terms of the status of getting this working for FLUXNet 2025? So we've in red here 3 different regional networks that are pretty advanced in implementing this processing pipeline and providing data for the community. So for example, in Ameriflux, we have almost 200 sites that are run through OneFlux. You can go to the Ameriflux website, you can download the data today, it's up to date. So it's not only going to 2014, of course, it's developed through almost to the present day. And as more data is submitted to Ameriflux, we reprocess these sites and make more data available to the community. ICOS is doing something similar, and so is TURN, the Australian and New Zealand OzFlux network as well. So each of these is implementing this OneFlux framework, making the data discoverable through their databases, and working on developing APIs so that that data can be searched and effectively downloaded. So this is super. It's like taken a lot of work, especially by those regional networks, particularly OzFlux, Ameriflux, and ICOS, the European Fluxes cluster, to get here. A lot of back-end development, a lot of code development to make this a standardized product that anybody can, in theory, use. But it is just those 3 networks. So there are a lot of regions in the world that are currently not covered in terms of they don't have the data processing capability to implement OneFlux, right? So they don't have a regional standard centralized processing unit, for example, or they do, but it's a lot of work, you know, and they haven't implemented it yet, but plan to in the future. And the current model is for all of those sites which are residing outside of these 3 networks to send their data to the European cluster database, which will then process their data and add it to their database to make it searchable. So this is kind of a stopgap method where we can follow this shuttle schema but still allow networks in Africa, Asia, all the other regions of the world that are not centralized. But I can't do anything about that. I can't click anything. Maybe somebody else can.
Yeah.
And make it discoverable. Right. So currently they will share the data with the Europeans, who will process it and add it to their database and then make it discoverable. So all sounds pretty advanced, right? That's great. We have at least 400 sites that are already in this system and being processed, which is really exciting. The current, that almost doubles the total database in 2015. We estimate there are about 2,000 sites globally. It's really hard to estimate because we just don't know, right, who's doing what where unless they tell us. But about 2,000. We also estimate from talking to some of the vendors that there are a few hundred sites being established each year globally. And we see this in Ameriflux. We really have that many joining the network every year. And so there's a lot out there. So it sounds like we've done a lot, but we're really just scratching the surface of the potential and unlocking that long tail of sites, getting them involved in the networks, especially if they're not in networks currently or in regions that have networks. And it's really the big challenge for amplifying FluxNet impact, I think. So the brief timeline of where we're at, we had a kickoff retreat this summer where a few of us got together in Iowa Ridge to talk about what this would look like. And how do we bring this plan of the FluxNet 2025 data system or data initiative to fruition? And there's a lot of work needed, a lot of like diplomacy, really, collaboration between the regional networks to get people on the same page, to align on what it actually is that is being planned and to co-develop that plan. And we're making great progress on that. And so we have like milestones along the way. We had the Ameriflux annual meeting about a month ago where we had a lot of discussions about this data system initiative and EGU. We're thinking of a data submission early next year, sometime in spring, or to set a deadline for people to submit their data. And this deadline is, because it's a dynamic database, people can submit anytime and be included in the database, but we need to think about how to incentivize submissions. And one way is through a data paper, or an annual or biannual paper exploring the data and demonstrating the data's utility to people. And so the deadline is for that. So if you want to be included in the paper, you got to submit your data by the deadline, and then we can start working on the paper. So thinking about kind of carrots and sticks for getting people in the community activated and incentivizing and helping them to submit data is a big part of the challenge. But ultimately, we're planning for data release by the end of next year. And then hopefully you're collaborating with teams like FluxCom or other upscaling initiatives to help scale the impact of this flux data. So one of the great goals is, how do we bring this data that's individual tower based and make it relevant for things like the IPCC, where flux data is not currently really referenced or used a whole lot, or the global carbon budget. Like, how do we, doesn't use flux data currently. How can we make our data more relevant to those bigger, more policy scale efforts? Okay, so I see a question online, but I'm just going to wrap up here before taking questions. 2 more slides. So the current plan was forming the team that's going to shepherd this forward, aligning with the regional networks and figuring out what is the plan, co-developing that plan, and setting up the timeline. We've put out the announcement and, importantly, an FAQ, because people had so many questions, like, how do we submit data to FluxNet? Well, you don't. You submit it to your regional network and they process it and then it's added. Things like that. What do we submit? What variables? Super important question. So we had to really set in stone all of those things. And if you have any questions about that, check out the FluxNet website. It is all up there, including the FAQ. Defining variables and coordinating with this effort. So there's a lot of synergy, obviously, and I'm looking forward to exploring that more. And what we haven't done, there's still an awful lot to do. Figuring out how we can effectively enable or help regional networks that are not very formalized to engage with the process and submit data. How do we help them with operational capacity to process data? We hear a lot of South Tower PIs out there who say, okay, I've got all this data, but I don't have anybody to process it, and I don't have time to do it myself. And even if I did process it, I'm a little worried about the quality control stuff. Would it just get rejected? Things like this, where we really need to help people to get their data in. A regional liaison is a model we're currently exploring for that. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read through this list. I think you can all read pretty well. But I'm happy to take any questions about how we do this, how we get there, how we can work together to make this happen and amplify the impact, most importantly. And that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. Wonderful. Thanks for that, Trevor.
We have a question, Ryan?
Yeah, we have a couple minutes or a minute or so for a couple minutes for questions. Michael.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to the beginning of the presentation where and tie that back to the end of your presentation where you talked about the desire to get more people to submit the data, and you had an estimate about how many sites and so forth, and from the sales figures from Lycor and probably together with Campbell, I would submit that probably the number of new sites is far above 100. It's probably more towards 150 to 200 that are being established every year, and you're seeing only a fraction of that one. And especially when you go back to the infographic, which is very nice, and you see that the largest part of that one is in the agricultural on the waste side, not in the wetlands. To me, the question is, what is the focus of FluxNet in this 2025 effort? Are you guys focusing on the wetlands, or are you focusing on the agricultural and waste side of things? Because in the wetlands, that's kind of nice, and there's probably less controversy there. But if you're looking at oil and gas, or if you're looking at waste facilities such as landfills, which we know are chronically underreporting, and the agricultural side, there are a lot of interests of people to have or not have the data. And so if you want to incentivize those people out of those fields, you probably need to do a little bit more shepherding around their sensitivities, such as the data cannot be downloadable by everybody, and also incentivize them in a way by way of geoprivacy, because I don't think that people really want to know how bad they're polluting the environment with methane to just put it very bluntly.
Yeah, that's a great question. We talked a lot about how do we appropriately incentivize people to share their data. I would say like the ag sector in general hasn't been, I don't know, problem's not the right word, but we have a lot of sites from the ag sector. It's the majority of the Ameriflux network, at least, from ag and croplands in general. In terms of data incentivizing and sharing, it's a really important question. Like, how do we enable a data sharing model that gets people who want to contribute? And it's kind of a tricky issue because we have a movement towards fair data, so open access, no barriers to data use, and this is super important for getting the data used by people. So we also have, we're adding a lot of value to that data by processing the data. And so the question becomes, why would we process a lot of data that we, even ourselves or anybody else in the community, cannot really use? So there's kind of a question of philosophy of data sharing and processing that's very important. In Ameriflux, we have thought about ways of addressing that by having more restrictive sharing policies. They're not very commonly used, I'd say. And also embargoes where a data contributor can embargo their data for a few years, also not commonly used at all. I think we are working on the model of, if you want to share your data, we're happy to help you share it. If you don't want to share your data, well, that's good for you. We can't help you all that much. For the FLUXNet perspective, because it's so much effort, so much data processing involved. Yeah, that's the current model. If we had a lot more funding, we would have a lot more bandwidth to engage with contributors who have different data sharing restrictions, I guess. But currently under the funding model, we don't, unfortunately.
Yeah, just on the sharing side, just a comment there. For instance, our data is funded by DOE, but we do have an export restriction under EAR 99. Those are a few countries, which is North Korea, Russia to some degree, Cuba, and I think Iran. And we definitely know that there are downloaders from Iran and Russia in there. But those are restrictions that are imposed by DOE. And so there's a fundamental issue there. And with respect to the ACT data, I would say that the methane ACT data was predominantly coming out of dairies or methane or rice fields. And from my experience working on both of those fields, I can tell you that nobody really there is interested in having the data published. As much as the data from the IPCC is fundamentally flawed and wrong, and it's necessary to have it, it's just we need to find a different way of how we can anonymize the data and so forth. Otherwise, it's just not going to get published.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think that'd be super interesting to work with. I think it is a bandwidth question from our perspective. We just don't have anybody funded to process this data, really, and so we're limited to doing things that we can. The low-hanging fruit, let's say, just a completely wrong word because it's such a heavy lift. Yeah, but if we had more funding, we could do more of that work. For data restricting from certain geolocations, etc., it's really tricky. We find even under the previous model where we had a more restrictive data use policy, it's really hard to enforce, almost impossible once you put something out there.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks for that. I think these are always ongoing discussions that we have, but just for the sake of time, we'll move on. If you do have questions, you can put them in the chat, and we'll, if we recover a bit of time here at the end, we can go through more discussions. So thank you for that, Trevor. Next, I'll have Dario give an update on Euroflux. So Dario, can you share your screen? Excellent.
Okay, I hope that you can see my screen. Do you see it? Okay.
Yep.
Great. Was a nice discussion before. Sorry, first I apologize that I cannot be there. Too much travel, as you can imagine. So I would really love to be there, but there is no way for me. So that let me give just a short introduction to ICOS. So it was very interesting the point before on the data sharing. We have very nice contribution from Russia also to our fluxes. So it's really tricky, the geopolitical situation. For the rest, I mean, the point is that at least in Europe, the feeling is that if we start to close the access to the data, we will lose the European sites. Okay, just because we are really online with the open access and nobody want to mix open and not open. So that's the direction at the moment in Europe that I'm very happy about, if I have to be honest. So first, what is ICOS? So ICOS, it's a research infrastructure in Europe. Has been funded 15 years ago for the construction phase by European Union. But then basically what happened is that the European countries decided to invest all together in a number of common research infrastructure, common facilities to observe things or to analyze or to do experiment on things that were highly relevant. And they go from a big telescope to very big medical facilities and so on. In our case for ICOS, it's on a greenhouse gases. So ICOS is not funded by EU, it's funded by the single member countries that put money of different amount in a different way, in kind or cash, to fund this large network, let's say, of observations. So there are stations measuring things, and then all the data go through a number of thematic centers that are responsible for the data processing and network organization and management, the definition of protocols, and so on. And then all the data from the three components, so the atmosphere, where they measure highly precise and accurate concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the ocean one, where they look more at what has been in the water, so the fixed and mobile stations in the water, where they measure dissolved CO2, dissolved oxygen, and so on, and pH. And then there are the ecosystem station, that is the largest part of the network, I have to say, where they, of course, use the EDI covariance. And the ecosystem thematic center is coordinated in Italy by me, but there are offices in France and Belgium. And again, everything in ICOS is really highly standardized, or we try to be as much as possible standardized. So the network is quite large. This map is even not really updated. And of course, there are missing the boat and the ships that travel and take measurement in the ocean through mobile stations. And however, you can see the light green, yellow dots are the ecosystem stations. So for the ecosystem station, we are focused on greenhouse gas fluxes and, of course, a lot of meteorological parameters. At the moment, we have 110 stations. 40 of them are our class 1, class 2, that are basically the high level that is equivalent somehow to the core sites concept in Ameriflux. What we do on these sessions, however, is something a little bit, let's say, more detailed if we want, because these stations send real-time, every day, the raw data of the EDI covariance and all the meteorological data to our carbon portal in Sweden. And then every morning we download everything, all the raw data and all the metadata that they submit. We process everything and we upload the near real-time fluxes. So there is a near real-time product updated every day with all the fluxes and meteo. And then twice per year, we reprocess the full-time series. What is important to say is that, again, everything starts from the raw data and go in the near real-time data go until the fluxes. For these 2 years release, they go until the final product. That includes, of course, the one flux processing and the FLUXNet standard. And they are open access with full metadata. It means that we have the model of each single sensor that is used for each single measurement and the position and the history of calibration and everything. And it's quite respectful of the fairness. And if you're an expert of fairness, you know that you will be never really fully compliant with the fairness. There are a lot of things to cover. However, we are moving forward on that. We are probably one of the most fair environmental infrastructure in Europe. Interesting for this workshop is that we just released something that is has been a community development of this instruction that is basically the protocol for the methane and N2O fluxes. So now the stations, the class 1, class 2 station are starting to equip them following this protocol for the raw data collection of methane and N2O that will be also processed centrally. So I would say by 2026, if we want to take 2025 as a build-up period where they have to set up the station, we have to set up the data processing, but then there will be this near real-time and also consolidated version of methane and N2O fluxes from the IGOS network. The ecosystem stations are not only fluxes, of course, there are a number of additional measurements that we do periodically and every 10 years, let's say, to characterize really the what we call the target area, so the portion of ecosystem that we want to monitor with the eddy-covariance station. We have these sparse plots and continuous plots where we measure vegetation parameters like species, biomass, and the tree diameter heights, diameter distribution, green area index, and of course, and then we have also sampling campaigns every year for the leaf nutrients, particular 9 elements, including, of course, carbon and nitrogen, and also soil sampling every 10 years to monitor the evolution of the soil organic carbon and nitrogen in the soil up to 1 meter depth. As I said, everything is open access. Everything will be is on the carbon portal. That's the address. You can go there and you will see it's even not needed to register. You just go there anonymously and download whatever you want. What is collected is only the IP address just to assign to the country to understand where the users are. But you can go there and download from the raw data to the process data, everything that you want. My last slide is on developments ongoing, and the first one is the one that really put me. This is really linked to what is ongoing on FLUXNET methane, and that I think where the synergies between our activities and what we are doing for FLUXNET that Trevor just perfectly presented, and what FLUXNET methane will do is that. We know that this is FLUXNET methane version 2. There has been a version 1. And in my opinion, we should try to avoid a version 3. Or better, we should have a version 3 of the initiative, maybe based more on the upscaling and in interpretation and understanding on the process, but not really in the data collection and processing, because we need really that all these experiences. And now there is the methane, but there will be also, there could be an N2O or an ozone or whatever. They are just building the knowledge that then will go in the regional networks, because the regional networks are the ones that have the long-term perspective and long-term funding, we hope at least, to make this sustainable in the future. So we are already working on in the pipeline, and exactly because of FLUXNET methane, we decided to start from the raw data handling and develop better the raw data that is not part of what FLUXNET methane is doing, and then wait and contribute to the development of the post-processing, so gap filling, attribution, different quality flags and checks in order to build up on this knowledge and then implement in the pipeline. That will be basically part of one Flux version, I don't know what. There are 3 other things that I guess it can be of interest. One is that we are really investing now in the urban eddy-covariance. We have a project where we are developing different techniques and different aspects. We have toll towers in 3 cities, Munich, Zurich, and Paris, where we are trying to see and understand how much what we can really retrieve from eddy-covariance measurement in urban. We are working a lot also with Tuscia Qing, that is our footprint lady in Europe, for an explicit footprint half-hourly mapping, so that together with the data we can provide some map of the exact footprint estimation for each single half hour. We have already prototyped, we already did one example, but we have to refine a little bit and then make this more as a product that everybody can use. And we are working on the raw data processing for non-IGOS standard setup. At the moment, we are handling the standard in IGOS, but we are really working on extending this to non-ICOS standard because we think and we see that the issue of raw data processing is becoming a problem and is also the limiting factor for some of the data sharing. That's all.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Dario. I'm glad you're wearing your Berkeley t-shirt.
Sure.
Great. Yeah, always exciting to see what ICOS is up to. Next, we'll hear from Hausen on the recent Ameriflux initiatives. So I will go ahead. And again, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat where we can address some of those during the break and have ongoing discussions online as well. So,
I do email.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, give me a second to bring the slide.
can you share?
Sorry, sure. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Okay, just send it to me and I'll get that done. Sorry, one second.
I'm on Zoom. So can people online?
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay, there we go. We're good. Sorry, that was my bad.
So again, my name is Qing. I'm a research scientist at Berkeley lab, so based on here. And together, I'm going to give a very brief intro but summary update about Ameriflux. Together, I also have Margaret Tong here. So she's the PI of our project, Ameriflux Management Project. I'll try to give some update, but also there are a lot of things going on in Ameriflux. I try to find a couple of things that might be relevant to this community. So, okay, moving. Just a very brief intro about Ameriflux. So this is a network of eddy currents tower. It's been almost 30 years already. It's a bottom-up effort. So start with a group of people. They run Flux Tower. They want to have a network sharing data even before our project. So just acknowledge that. There's a picture of a lot of sites we selected to see how diverse they are and where they are across North, South America. Today, we have roughly more than 600 sites registered to Ameriflux. On average, we have 40 new sites coming, join every year. A lot of them, they are active, but there are some historical ones for sure. Color represent the different ecosystem type. I would say forest still the dominant type, right? Roughly 200 Ameriflux sites, they're forests, but you see wetlands, so you can actually, there are more than 100 wetland sites right now in Ameriflux. I would say a lot of it's thanks to the effort of the FLUXNet massing this initiative actually promote a lot of new wetlands in the last 5 years, I'd say. Within the network, most of them, they're funded by different funding agencies and run by different group of people, but a subset of the site we call Ameriflux core site that's sponsored by DOE and also our project directly. These are the location of the site across the United States, but also the PI leading the effort and also the picture of their tower. A lot of them, they are long-term site, more than 10 years, almost to even 30 years already. So not just site, right? Another important portion of perspective of Ameriflux is the data sharing. This is kind of the foundation of the network since the beginning. So where's the data? If you look at only the flux data on the left-hand side, this is the mostly focused on CO2 flux, water flux data. This is the data we have available today. So almost 500 sites. We're waiting who will be the fifth 500 site sharing the data. There's more than 3,000 site years of data available. So left-hand side represent, this is what we call base data set. This is
very close to what people, PI, like a lot of people here. You process your data, quality control, prepare the data in a standard way, submit to us. We do an independent QC and make sure they comply to the network standard format and quality, and we make that release. So this is available. Important part will be this data set, including the methane flux here. Another version of data is what we take, Trevor just mentioned earlier about one flux processing. We take from the base data set, we do a post-processing. So this is gap filling, partition the CO2 flux into GPP, respiration, energy balance, closure, correction, something like that. This is what we process. And right now we have more than, if you count the previous FLUXNet 2015 together, we have more than 200 sites available from Ameriflux network. I just briefly mention about the color coding here. This represents the timing of this data release, especially this is being updated. Especially for FluxNet, the darker blue means what the Ameriflux being able to process in the recent years. So we pretty much double, triple this number of the site we can host. Just come back a little bit on methane, particularly since this is a methane workshop. So right now, based on our best knowledge, I think there are roughly 150 sites within Ameriflux that measure methane flux. Either they measure for a period of time or they are measuring right now. So this is what we, based on our knowledge so far, a location of the site is shown here. Half of them have data, methane flux data in Ameriflux available right now. So that means they're good. I mean, think about a number. I remember first workshop we had, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago. I think we have a dozen of sites with methane flux data available. So thanks all of you to make this happen, but also a lot of space to grow, right? So another half of the site, they haven't published the data here yet, or maybe some of them they choose not to including methane in their submission. So there are a lot of things we can do together to bridge this gap. Come back a little bit. We talk about Ameriflux. The project I work on is Ameriflux management project. So this is supported by DOE, a long-term project. The idea is to support, but also to try to provide a technical data support to the Ameriflux community. I mentioned core site a little bit earlier. These are the sites we directly sponsor, but also there are a couple hundred of sites that we're not directly sponsored. So we provide data support, we provide technical support. I'll try to briefly mention, and this is our team, including a couple of them here, and maybe on Zoom. A few things we do for data support, I try to highlight the one, especially for methane, is for sure, the most important part, we build a pipeline, right? We're taking the data from all the PI they prepare, and we do independent QC and make a release as a base data product, but also further we do one flux processing to make it available. So this is a very, very, very summarized diagram of what we did here, but there's a lot of effort behind the thing. I want to mention about data policy. This is an important thing we work with the community to promote in the last couple of years, adopting a more open policy. So this is new. Right now, I'd say more than 70 to 80% of the site adopting this policy. So CC by 4. That means if you're a data user, you're a modeler, you can be much easier to access the data and run your model across a couple hundred sites without contacting each other. I mean, there's a lot of benefit about doing that, but you are not required to do that. For data user, especially you try to build a couple of things, right? Think about how you use data from a couple hundred sites. So a lot of our efforts on the web feature development, right? So how do you design a site page? How do you design a site search page to make people do things much easier? I won't mention all the detail, just briefly something here. We also have some other way. I know a lot of people like doing code instead of going to web base. So we do have some our package facilitate the search, but also download Ameriflux data much easier. Briefly mention about API. I won't go into detail. If you're really into something like that, right? You want to have an API, you want to have a way to query Ameriflux data much easier and do everything on your code, and maybe in a near real-time basis. I mean, there are potential capability you can do that. I won't go in detail. Find me if you're really into that. Another category of support we're providing is tech support. This is mostly about instrumentation, loaner, calibration gases. We provide free calibration gases to register Ameriflux site. There's some criteria about who is qualified, but this is a lot of resources you can use to. But also loaner, right? So we provide loaner instrumentation in case you have to calibrate your sensor, you have something happen to your sensor, you need something to bridge gap for 3 months, or maybe you have a very unique opportunity about research, but you're waiting for your funding to get your sensor funding in place. We might be able to provide support. We have methane sensor loaner available. So talk to me or Margaret if you have any interest on that. I will skip this one. Rapid response. So this is a whole set of eddy current system is also available for long. You have to write small, very short proposal about what kind of thing you want to do. You call rapid response, and this can be long for 1 to 3 years. This is a complete set of a sensor for eddy currents and mass sensor. These are a couple of pictures here show how this rapid response system being applied in a couple other previous example. And also, especially the new one is we have 3 dedicated rapid response system for urban, including methane. So it's another thing. My last slide will be, I know a lot of people here are coming from a site team. Maybe you're familiar with Ameriflux, or maybe you're totally new, or maybe considering joining, but I'll leave it here. It's very quick to register your site to Ameriflux. I mean, there's only one template to fill it out, 15 minutes, I would say. And you can start the process and learn about what we can provide, what kind of service support we can do. Also, I would say another will be Ameriflux. Most important part will be this is a network of people. So join the network means you have a lot of connection, talk to people, they have different expertise and maybe can help you with the site or process your data in a way. So I'll stop here. I'd be happy to answer any question, and thank you.
Great, thanks, Tyson. We can do a couple quick questions. Yeah, Rob?
Quick one, Hassan, are there restrictions on the loaner instruments outside of the US or North America?
It need to be a Ameriflux registered site. We do provide loaner to site outside of the state. There's some additional paperwork need to go through, understanding, especially export sensor. I think we have previous example. We do loan some sensor to Panama already, so I know it can happen. It's just a couple of steps. There are some criteria about, because there are so many sites, we do have some new criteria about who's qualified to receive something like this. So we need to be a Ameriflux site, and there are some, I can walk through the detail about who's qualified. Margaret, you want to say something?
Did you also ask about rapid response or just the low areas? Like in whole system or
I'm
just?
just the whole, there are a bunch of international people online. I'm just curious about the access to people.
And so we can loan that rapid response system, the package was for any covariance within the Americas. We have been restricted to the US, but do that across the Americas.
North and South, across North and South America.
Yeah.
For a period, for example, 6 months or
For up to 3 months. Right now, we are considering a loan in Mexico City. So there's some countries that are a little harder on the import-export side.
Great, thank you. And again, folks are welcome to, oh, sorry. Jim.
Can I ask Rob a question?
Sure.
Yeah, just you showed a map and there were some, I think they were blue dots that you said weren't yet in the network. And I wondered which network you were to, because you have all these.
So the map I showed, the blue dots were sites that were already in FLUXNet methane V1.
Okay.
The gray dots were sites that we think have ongoing methane measurements that aren't in any network as far as we can tell. And the red dots, so there are opportunities for us to try and bring sites in, especially in the tropics. The red dots were ones that were newly either established should be incorporated into these who've already said they'll participate.
It's a great, and also the opportunities to get them into the regional network.
Yes.
Data. Thanks. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. So sounds like lots of opportunities for collaboration, synergies. So I'll try to catch up a little bit of time here. Just going over some of the lessons learned from FLUXNet Methane version 1. So again, I won't dwell too long on this, but we talk a lot about sort of fair data, open access data. Oh, okay, sorry, let me. There. Sure. Sorry, 1 second. All right, does it show up now?
Good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I was saying, we talk a lot about sort of fair data, open access data, and what do we get as contributors, right? It takes us a lot of time and effort and energy to process data for our sites. So, going over just a couple examples of what are some of the benefits of sharing for these large networks. So we've talked a lot about FLUXNet, right? We know that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? We've learned a lot of lessons by pooling together from across the globe. We learn a lot by synthesizing data across, networks of sites or upscaling global products. So I think there's a lot of value to be learned. But we also talked about, how this is only currently for CO2, water, and energy fluxes. So a lot of this stems from the fact that, methane measurements are newer additions to the flux community. A lot of these sort of open path sensors only came online, after sort of CO2 and measurements were adopted. So there's sort of this legacy effect that methane only came a little bit later. But there's really been sort of this rapidly growing number of measurements. In 2018, we had over 180 sites worldwide. Now we know that it's several hundred more sites that have been measuring methane. Right, we're covering sort of a pretty good climate space here, but there's some definitely notable gaps here across the tropics in particular. So when we put together FLUXNet Methane version 1. As we mentioned, we had 81 sites distributed across a wide range of different wetland types, upland systems as well. So not just wetlands, but it tends to focus on wetland systems since these are higher emitting sites. But clearly we have some gaps in where the data is available. But despite that, we were able to come up with a lot of interesting science. So again, if you want to download this link, it's available on the FLUXNet webpage. We can see it here. This is the link. You can put this into Google and find it pretty easily. Right, but one of the things that this only exists thanks to data providers. So here are some example of sites. But these types of efforts, as we know, really bring together everyone from the Flux community. It wouldn't be possible without data providers. And running my own Flux towers, I know how much work goes into this. So we really do appreciate everyone who contributes to these efforts. But with our 81 sites that we've had before, we've still been able to answer a lot of questions related to the global methane cycle. So as Rob mentioned, we've had over 14 papers that have arisen from our FLUXNet Methane version 1 effort. And we really tried to be as inclusive as possible. So a number of these papers have, over 60 co-authors, so a large number of co-authors that have contributed to all of these sites. And we have similar initiatives for FLUXNet Methane version 2.0. So we really try to make this an effort that multiple people are going to benefit from. So some of the topics that we've explored are looking at variations in methane fluxes across sites and trying to understand predictors of wetland fluxes across sites. We've worked on methane gap filling. So again, leveraging machine learning to inform methane gap filling. Methane presents its own set of unique challenges that require some special methods or different variables to gap fill these. We've worked a lot with different modeling groups and model benchmarking efforts. So quite a few papers arising from that. And then we've also worked on upscaling these measurements. So similar to what FluxCom has done for CO2, water, and energy fluxes, we've also been working on this for methane. focusing on sort of regional products and also global products and rice as well. I'm not going to go into all of this, but I just wanted to highlight these efforts and really show, the large number of co-authors that have been involved in this as some incentive to contribute to these efforts. So just a couple examples of some work that we've done. So for example, understanding predictors of methane fluxes across different scales. So we know that methane emissions, similar to sort of CO2, are a superposition of variations that occur at different timescales. So we have, seasonality in our fluxes. We have sort of short-term fluctuations, such as weather patterns going through variations at diurnal scales. And so we looked at what were some of the predictors of methane fluxes across these different scales. So for example, looking at what are the dominant predictors at the seasonal scale. So, strong influences of air temperature and soil temperature coming with different lags, the importance of water table depth, but predominantly at sites where temperature variations were much lower. So in the tropics, water levels being particularly important, again, having some lags in these systems. Slightly different, we see sort of at these multi-day scales, temperature and water levels being important, but also pressure fluctuations, right? These pressure systems coming through and allowing this methane to be released. And then, for example, over the course of a day, the importance of the transport of methane through plants. So we've really been able to sort of leverage this data and learn a lot from it. We've also found that methane has sort of these hysteresis response to temperature, right? So rather than sort of this standard temperature response, right? It varies whether you're at sort of the beginning of the growing season or the end of the growing season. So, try to come up with a single temperature response might not be adequate enough. But, coming up with these different parameterizations at different sites at different times gets challenging. So maybe we need to, really explicitly consider methane production, oxidation, and transport pathways more explicitly in models to try to capture some of these underlying dynamics. We've also been working, as I mentioned, with a lot of modeling groups to sort of leverage these observations. So this is a model data sort of fusion approach here, simulating all the different production pathways, oxidation pathways, and transport pathways, and coupling this with fluxes to not just predict the flux, but also what are the different transport pathways. So for example, here, right, these are the flux observations in black, and here we can see the different transport pathways. So whether it's plant mediated, which tends to dominate, or whether you see ebullition or diffusion. So really trying to gain more information from the direct measurements of fluxes, right, which don't ultimately give us the production, oxidation, and transport. But by combining models with flux observations and then complementing them with more field observations, we can really start to tease apart some of these different processes. So some other lessons learned. So we've leveraged the observational data set and compared it with models. So through the ILAM, so the International Land Model Benchmarking system here. And what we can see, so these are the observational constraints comparing top-down and bottom-up models across a range of different models. This is if we use, all the models here. If we start selecting some of the best performing models, we can see that even though we might reduce the spread in the observations between top-down and bottom-up, we still see a large discrepancy between bottom-up models of methane and top-down models of methane. And so this suggests, right, so our model performance ranking is really subject to benchmark selection and really highlighting the importance for expanded coverage of benchmarking sites across a wide range of different environmental conditions. So again, we can see the value of including additional sites in the network. So as I mentioned here, right, we're now developing FLUXNet methane version 2. We can see that we're trying to expand the number of sites we have. Trying to expand the number of sites that we have across the globe, and we're really trying to focus on the tropics, as Rob said. we've learned a number of lessons from FLUXNet Methane version 1, and also that I've learned as a Flux PI myself over the last, decade or more. Right, we know that eddy covariance measurements are challenging, both in terms of the theory, the site selection, sensor selection and operation, right? Handling data. How do we do all of this? This can be rather challenging, right? There's a lot of information that's available. And then it's also challenging to handle all this data. So I think it's really exciting that the different Flux networks have been working on different tools and making these tools available. And this is something that we're trying to help with for version 2. So I know that, finding the time to even submit these data to the network can be challenging. And so this is sort of what led to the motivation of this workshop, was coming up with tools and resources that can make it easier to submit our data, visualize our data, and help inform some of these efforts. So hopefully this cartoon doesn't come bear fruit, but the challenges of automating these things, and something can go wrong. But hopefully we've tested it enough that it will work. But really, we have been working on automating and implementing some of these pipelines to make it easier to process the data. We're not handling the high frequency data. Dario mentioned ICOS is working on that, which is great. There's also a FLUXNet working group on methane and N2O. But as part of this workshop, right, we just wanted to share some of the resources that we've been developing, that we've been implementing online, so that people can follow along and sort of reduce the barrier to use some of these tools. But I do want to emphasize that it's just one approach, right? There's a lot of approaches that are being developed, which is great. I provided a couple of links on the slide here, and also in the tutorial materials. But again, right, this is sort of what led us to this workshop here, is to come up with some tools that can help the community, and we can learn from each other. I think the more we work together, the more we learn, and the more we can improve these global products. Just a quick note, and again, we're going to send out another sort of follow-up survey for participation in FLUXNet Methane, and we're going to coordinate with the FLUXNet 2025 data initiative. But we want to try to streamline and help make this as easy as possible. And by the end of the tutorial today, you should have data in the format that you can upload to your regional network. And so that's really what we're trying to build towards over the next day and a half. All right. In the sake of time, we'll go to the next presentation. I have Gavin McNicol, who's going to be presenting here. Gavin, if you want to go ahead and share.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thanks for this chance to share a little bit about our upscaling work and a few thoughts about how FLUXNet Methane version 2 can improve upscaling in the future. Am I breaking up, by the way?
No. Are you sharing your slides yet?
Yes, very good.
At the top of the screen, Sarah, top of Zoom, it's a Gavin McNicol screen.
Oh.
Yeah, no, I don't think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you just maximized. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, there we go.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the chance to present on our upscaling work and share some thoughts about how this FLUXNet Methane version 2 can improve our work. So I think the main opportunity I want to convey is that Flux network data is big data. That's kind of a phrase from machine learning, but this rapidly expanding global network of sites is largely underutilized in models, as people have mentioned before, global models of methane emissions, but really is ideal for machine learning based upscaling to get at global estimates of emissions. I want to emphasize that I see upscaling as a workflow and not as a model. And it's really a modular workflow where at each stage of this series of steps, we can substitute in different data, different concepts or processes, and then different modeling approaches. But I think it always combines some amount of interpolation and extrapolation across both time and space. And I think it's good to be conscious of that when we're moving to the global scale from site level measurements. And so the general, the gist of the workflow is that we have a pattern such as methane flux. We want to understand it with reference to understood processes. And we bring data to bear on both the pattern and the process, a mixture of raster, point, polygon data for those explanatory variables, and then our F methane variable for methane flux. And then we want to define some function F of those predictors to predict our methane flux. And this is where I've worked in the past with random forest models, but I think increasingly people are moving to what you might call AI, which is typically neural network based architectures. The best way I've been able to think about the difference is that there's sort of a sports analogy where maybe a random forest is a little bit more like a sports pundit who might be reviewing all the available past season data to make a prediction about whether a team or a player will perform well in the future. Whereas an AI model is more like a fan or a player who doesn't really know why they have an intuition about who's going to win, but they've learned from a lot of experience. So once they have our model, we then need globally gridded maps of those predictor variables, and we can generate globally upscaled estimates of fluxes. And I really like this dynamic 3D map that FluxCom put together for net ecosystem exchange of CO2. And I think it's something that we could aim for with our upscaling of methane to these kind of effective communication and visualization projects. So I think that the main take home from our first attempt to upscale wetland methane emissions globally is that that it seems to work. We generated an estimate of total emissions from 119 site years of methane flux data. We used a random forest model, and we went through a predictor selection procedure that resulted in a simple model with air temperature, EVI, canopy height and climate predictors. And so our estimate, in spite of not informing the model structure with any process knowledge, we generated an estimate of 146 teragrams of methane per year, which is kind of right in the middle of the 2016 global methane budget estimates, a little bit different than the most recent ones. I did just want to show that there's ways that we can then visualize and query these globally gridded methane products. So we can look at the average emissions on the top left here. We can simply, subtract our emissions from other products and highlight areas of discrepancy. We can also propagate uncertainties from the measurements all the way through to the product and look, see the patterns there. As unsurprisingly, our largest uncertainties are in the tropics. And then also we can not just think about the average emissions, but also think about the time series, the seasonality of the emissions. So we can look at the correlation over time between different products. And so I mentioned that there's a combination of interpolation and extrapolation in all upscaling. Our uncertainties are applicable in domains of interpolation, but when we extrapolate beyond the bounds of our data, our uncertainties are going to also include undefined uncertainty. So essentially, we don't know how wrong we are. That being said, we can query a little bit and learn something about those areas of extrapolation. So in this analysis, in opaque colors, the darker colors, we're showing regions of extrapolation where it's very likely that our estimates are biased with respect to the true values. And also this visualization weights domains regions where the emissions differences will have a large impact on the global total. That kind of reflects something that Robbo said earlier, that the tropics are really where errors or uncertainties are going to play a big role in, or we need to reduce those errors and uncertainties to get at the global budget better. So I wanted to share a few thoughts about future directions and illustrate them quickly. So one is that we can actually go from these spatially averaged fluxes at the tower down to footprint weighted fluxes that are approximating in a spatially explicit map of fluxes within a tower footprint. There's a lot of opportunity, I think, to use higher resolution remote sensing predictor data. And then we can also think a little bit, I think, in a more ecosystem oriented way about methane at a global scale. So just to quickly illustrate these points, wetlands are notoriously heterogeneous spatially, and we average a lot of that out when we look at a tower footprint. This error is incorporated into our driver response relationships that we use in modeling and propagates to the global scale estimates. So, very briefly, that there's emerging approaches to downscale from the tower flux to a spatially explicit map of emissions, where we can identify hotspots of emission, but maybe also tie those emission dynamics, flux dynamics, to more relevant soil and ecosystem properties. So you can look at, in this case, we're exploring at Argonne National Lab, doing this downscaling to link spatially explicit methane fluxes within the footprint, soil temperature, and moisture. So I think this is a generally promising way to maybe downscale first and then get more specific information to upscale. The other thing is that wetlands and uplands have distinct methane regimes, but they're often smooshed together in a grid cell of a coarse remote sensing product. And so I think that the higher resolution remote sensing scenes are going to be vital to distinguish situations like this on the right, where you have a riparian wetland area that's actually, this is not a filtered image, it's a real image, was protected from an upland fire. And so you can imagine there's some really different carbon cycle consequences there. So pulling those apart in the remote sensing data will be good path forward. And just to illustrate that, here, the actual image here is from a planet scope analysis that McHugh Moon led in 2022. This is in the Sacramento Delta, super mixed land use environment. And you can see that, if you overlay an approximate MODIS pixel on top of that, you're averaging out a lot of information. And then the third thing is that I think I'm really excited by the community dimension here and the science question aspects, where we can bring ecosystem scientists who have mostly worked at the site to landscape scale or even the microbial scale to kind of engage in conversations about global methane or other fluxes. But I think that the tools and frameworks that we use to analyze the global products are still kind of they still maybe rightly reflect for now the climate policy priorities, but there's other scientific dimensions to the global patterns in methane. So just to illustrate that, in the most recent global methane budget, there is an estimate here in the lower left for emissions from Brazil. But in terms of like ecoregion, that doesn't really correspond much. It doesn't really tell us much about the ecosystem processes or conditions on the ground. You can see there's a huge gradient in ecosystem cover, probably also moisture and soil conditions. And so I think as an ecosystem scientist, I'm excited. As an ecosystem scientist, I'm excited by what we can learn about the emergent dynamics of methane at global scales. And just one way we've been exploring that is to just think about other ways to organize global patterns and how we do that. Have we done that in the past? So on the lower left is a map of global climate zones. We've overlaid methane fluxes and flux towers on top of that to see, where are emissions occurring, where are these different climate regions, to help with interpretation. I already showed the figure on the top right, which is sort of using the model predictors to define constituencies. And then finally on the lower right, we're also exploring what we're calling a process constituency. And so that would be where we're actually using the dynamics and behavior of the methane time series across the globe to define clusters. So these are kind of phenological clusters based upon similarities in the dynamics of methane over time. So yeah, I'll leave that there, but there's also a lot of advances in modeling that are already being implemented. And so that's what the next presentation will be about from my collaborator, Qing Zhu. Thanks.
So I advance. Oh, do I advance? Oh, next.
Cool. All right. The shortest version is we need more time, or we need more data. I'm gonna wait for the V2 data set come out and do the upscaling. That's the shortest version. But we need to at least do something. So the question I wanted to address is how to extrapolate site level measurements to the global wetlands, to the regional scales. And so starting from the V1 efforts, we start from those 81 sites, and we try to extrapolate to that wetland regions that highlight by different colors, meaning different wetland types. So just thinking about historically, what are the available methods to do the upscaling? So the most classic BGC approach is you have a physical model, you have a BGC model, you build it first, you have ODE equation already defined, and you calibrate at the available sites that you have, so 81 sites in total. And then you do the global extrapolation and estimate global total. That's what, that is the GCP bottom-up approach. Although it's not strictly defined how many sites and how should you use those FLUXNETs, the methane data sets to calibrate the bottom-up models. But this is the general approach. So you have a model, do calibration, do extrapolation. And then the second approach is machine learning. This is the first literature that I can find in the using neural network to do the upscaling for methane. But it starts from 34 chamber sites, but it was able to actually do a fairly reasonable, well-performed work on this calibration and also the testing data set. So then they will be able to extrapolate that to the entire bore active region using those only 34 chamber sites, which seems very reasonable. So we have two choices here. And what's the difference is if you think about this in the 2x2 matrix, from a Bayesian perspective in this way, is that for the BGC approach, you have very strong physical prior. They're not necessarily right, but you have that prior already built in the model or in your mind. And then, however, you have a very weak data constraint because if you have already worked with the BGC model, you know that how messy it's going to be if you wanted to calibrate the model at sites, particularly you have 81 sites. And for the machine learning model, most of the time you don't have any prior, you don't have any constraint. So it's meaning no physical knowledge at all. And however, you rely totally on the data, so you have a very strong data constraint. What does it mean? So BGC approach, you have strong physical prior, but some of them are totally wrong. So you have to admit that because like a BGC modeler developer, I wrote this BGC equation, I don't trust that. For example, methane production, how come that relates to MPP and RH? It should be related to the substrate like acetate, CO2 or hydrogen, but you don't have that processes, fine enough processes to code up in the model. And secondly, the Q10 temperature response, that's a very obvious one, why we use Q10, right? Why Q10 measurements are so variable, but we still use one single Q10 values in the model to define the temperature response. And as long as you have that very strong physically defined prior, then how come you can fit the model, fit the data very well? So there's no chance at all. And so, yes. Respiration. You use respiration as a proxy here. And so that's why you're on the fit. You have a very weak data constraint. Although you might have more and more data available, but you just cannot easily digest in the BGC model. And in the machine learning model, the opposite way, you don't have any physical prior. Thinking of this example as a very simple sine equation fitting. So if you can use many different approaches to fit within the available data domain, and they do equally good job. But when you do extrapolation, and it can be anything, it go wild. So it basically means overfit for that particular period data domain. So what happened in the literature is like this. So what can we do next? And there are solutions coming from the machine learning community. They say, oh, you need to combine those two. You need to have first think about what are the most robust prior that you can have, and don't use all the prior. Don't use the BGC model. And then you have a data constraint, of course, but it's compromised with the prior physical knowledge. And you think is very, very confident about that. So this physical informed neural network come out and basically provide that framework for you. You need to define your robust prior, and you need to provide some data, not a huge amount of data, but some data, and combine them together in a way that you can end up with a very reasonable projection. So imagine you wanted to train your model for only those dots, and you want to capture roughly the trajectory. And this physical informed neural net is the only way you can get it. However, if we can use that PI physical informed neural network in our context, perfect, everything is resolved. But we don't know the perfect form of ODE, so you don't know the physics very well, or well enough to define your PI, the physical informed neural net. So what we do is we think causality is a high-level abstraction of ODE because it tells you the dependency, tells you the interactions, although it's not exact term that tells you this variable multiplied by that variable, and then maybe do another derivative that give you the result variable. It's not in that sense, but it tells you which variable is dominant in the pattern that determine the other variable and how they interact with the other variables. So this approach we apply not for the mapping first, we test here for the near surface land atmosphere interaction. So you can see there's soil, near surface vegetation, and near surface air atmospheric variable, and they form a very complex neural network. You cannot come up with a perfect ODE for that, but you can infer a very, very robust causal network for this system. Very similar thing for our methane upscaling work as well. So we take that and merge with the neural network. So then you have a causal structure on the left and bottom. That's the observed robust prior. And you also have your model generated internal structure. That's the, we use attention to implement this inside this neural network. So basically you can compare them together, give you a bias, structure bias that tells you how well your model can reproduce the observed data, but also under the guidance of a robust prior or robust physical rule. That's the causal network. And so you add up into your loss function. Then if you train this model, it will care two parts. One is how well the model perform in terms of simulated methane flux. And second is how well this model can capture the robust prior that you define by the causality network. So why it matters? You might think still, maybe it's not still convincing enough, but if you look at the inferred causal network from on the left is just a random neural network model. We picked LSTM, you can use any. And it gives you a very high performance, of course. And the second is our causal constraint neural network. Also give you same performance, maybe a little worse, but not statistically not significant difference. Any observation. So you can, if you don't do extrapolation, you just do site level evaluation, I think you can use both LSTM or the causal STM. No difference at all. Just like the example that I showed, if you only care about the middle part, it doesn't really matter. But if you want to do extrapolation, you want to use the second one because it has the correct response that define the way you do the projection at the two ends. And so based on this, we do regional upscaling, and you can see the performance is very high. So we combine easy towers and also chamber sites, yellow dots, because over Borearctic, you have a big region, hotspot emission region that's not covered by easy tower sites. So we combine them together, do the causal ML, and train at site and do the extrapolation for the entire Borearctic region. So you see this time series, 2 decades of time series, and compare with bottom-up and top-down estimate from GCPs. I wanted to, so this is not the end, this is just start of the game. So I want to think about next. Because V2 is coming, and I hope we will have V3 and V4 and going forward, because we need more and more data. But the second question is if we can have an upscaling products. And then the second question is, we're going to collect more data or synthesize more data. Where are those data should be coming from? From an upscaling perspective, we want more data sets from underrepresented sites. We don't want more data is of course better, but if you have a site that has a very similar condition, similar methane flux emissions patterns with another site and do long-term monitoring, it helps in terms of science, but it doesn't help in terms of upscaling. So we wanted to see, can we find, using the same exercise, using the same upscaling exercise, can we find underrepresented regions? So we use this is a technical framework. We start from the GCP benchmark. That's the 16 bottom-up model mean, 165 teragram per year on the top. And then we use sampling strategy, basically assume we have easy tower size at the grid cell. So we sample the time series from the benchmark. And we also do chamber because there are many different places, there are hotspot emission places that are covered by chamber. And then we reconstruct the benchmark. The closer you can get in terms of this reverse upscaling approach, the better representativeness you get. If that is still not enough, of course that is because V1 just have 81 sites. So, and you can sample any places, any hypothetical places on this map, but only for the places, the grid cell that are covered by wetlands. And you can repeatedly do that and sample as many sites as you want to inform which region, open climate region, will give you a better and better reconstruction to tell you the representativeness. And so here are the results. One major message here is if you want to expand easy towers, the most easiest thing is to go to those existing chamber sites and do a long-term flux tower measurements, because I think there are a lot of prior knowledge when people go and do the chamber measurements, they know it is a good place to measure. So the blue line is the reconstruction error only using easy tower. If you also have measurements capacity at chamber sites, it will reduce the orange line to the orange line, much, much closer to the benchmark. That's the black line. Okay, so if you want to do further, then you can hypothetically sample any size you want. Here we start from 20 sites all the way to 100 sites. So it tells you the green bar reconstruction is good enough, meaning only tens of sites maybe are needed, not hundreds of sites. But you need to prioritize those over tropical region, including those semi-arid, seasonal flooded tropical wetlands, to have this good reconstruction, good enough reconstruction. You cannot do it perfectly because globally you have all those unresolved heterogeneity. But tens of sites is enough over tropical region that we hope we have those new sites coming in the V2 data set. That's why I have a big hope for that. And then we can have a much better, we can update our global upscaling, have a much better estimates at global scale. I want to stop here. So this is the main message I want to deliver. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And get this up. Okay, all right, so shifting gears to high frequency data just for a little bit, and then we'll get back to 30-minute QCQA.
But hi, can you hear me and can you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to give this talk. My name is Toprak Aslan. I currently work in Finnish Meteorological Institute, but the work I will talk about was conducted in the University of Helsinki. This workshop is mainly related to gap filling and upscaling, but the accuracy of those procedures depend on the quality of half power fluxes. And here the quality, of course, refers to how well the fluxes represents the ecosystem processes. I listed few reasons that would make the fluxes less representative. Maybe the most important one is that the theoretical assumptions which do not hold. And another one is instrument and configuration related issues. And the last one is related to inaccurate data processing. This last issue is partly related to shortcomings of the methodology, of course, used for some processing steps. But it is also related to inaccurate application of the methodology. And frequency response correction is a very important post-processing step, and especially for close path gases. And this step is very open to make mistakes. And in this paper that you see on the right, that came out 3 years ago, we investigated one shortcoming in this correction step and provided a simple solution. Shortly, we improved the response time estimation here. But I will not talk about the results too much. Instead, I will present the shortcoming in the current methodology and provide practical suggestion to overcome the shortcoming. So in the end, you can directly implement this thing in your data. But shortly on frequency response correction, this step corrects the flux loss caused by the systematic spectral filtering. Here in the figure, we see gas cause spectra, and this cause spectra we would like to measure. And the area under this curve gives us covariance, but the measured spectra is attenuated version of it. And it is filtered both in the low and high frequency part. And there are different reasons responsible for the loss for different regions. But for the gases measured with the closed path setup, the main reason is tube transport for high frequency losses. And there are many methods available to correct this loss that you see in this box. These are the ones available in EditPro. Characterization of filtering done by the system. So this is the first step in the correction procedure. This simply means defining transfer functions. And the transfer functions can be theoretical predefined equations, or alternatively, it can be defined experimentally by measured data. And the ICOS recommends this approach actually. And when you choose Ibrom or Fratini methods, you practically choose this approach. And in this approach, the filtering is defined by one transfer function you see now on the right. The equation here is a function of frequency, but it is described by only one variable that highlighted with red in the equations in there. And the upper one is response time, and the bottom one is a cutoff frequency, but they can be converted to each other easily. The ultimate goal here is then to reach these variables for the first step. And to do so, we fit the equation to the ratio of measured gas spectra and the temperature spectra. But before doing so, there is one more step, the noise removal. And this is because the gas spectra is contaminated by the noise, and it should be removed. And this noise removal procedure causes overestimation of response time, and ultimately it causes overestimation of correction factors and fluxes. Again, this is simply what we investigated in the paper and provided a simple solution. But to better understand what was problematic and what was improved, we need to take a look at the current noise removal procedure. Here in the figure, we see the spectra of temperature that is shown with red, and it is unattenuated, and there is no noise contamination in the spectra. But the blue one is gas spectra, and this one starts attenuating already in the inertial subrange. And towards high frequency, then the signal is slowly fading away and the noise starts dominating. So this distortion that we see in the high frequency end is basically the noise, and it should be removed. And to do so, a linear fit is to the high frequency end of the spectrum. Within the range, you can decide in EditPro and highlight it here. And this fit is extended towards the lower frequencies and finally subtracted from the noisy spectrum, from the blue one. And finally, we get this black one that is a noise-free gas spectrum. Then we can proceed with the response time estimation. This equation that you see on the left is fit to the spectra, and the response time and cutoff frequency is obtained. So this is the procedure in a nutshell. But here the noise fitting range is decided by visual inspection, and this is the ideal case. But the many researchers use default fitting threshold provided in EditPro, and it is 1 Hertz. And one important issue to highlight here is that the slope of this fit should be 1. If we assume the noise is white noise, then the slope should be 1. But if it is smaller than 1, then this removes part of the signal and it caused overestimation of response time. So this is the problem here. In EditPro, when you choose the methods here, then you define the threshold here for each gas, uses CO2, water vapor, methane, and other gases. But if you notice that there is only one threshold for water vapor, and I think which is quite problematic, because attenuation of water vapor depends on relative humidity. And this one fixed threshold is a big source of uncertainty in water fluxes and energy balance closure, actually. I will show some real-world examples to better understand the consequences of different noise removal threshold. I use the data from Sihkanava wetland that is located in southern Finland. In the figure on the right, you see the temperature spectra shown with red and the CO2 spectra shown with blue. So here I use CO2 data, but this is more important for non-CO2 gases. In CO2 spectra in the high frequency, and then you can already see that this noise distortion. But another thing to notice is that the attenuation is very low actually. So most of the spectrum, the blue line is following the red one, which is unattenuated. So we can expect actually very small response time in this case. Okay, in the first case, now I define the threshold with the visual inspection, 3.5 Hertz. But this is still subjective, of course. This results in almost 0.1 second response time, and the slope is 0.82, and this is smaller than 1. So we can here already assume that this response time is overestimated. And if we use 2 Hertz as threshold, then we get bigger response time and smaller slope. Finally, when we use the default threshold in EdiPro, 1 Hertz, the slope becomes negative and the response time increases even further. And later I use these response times in correction factor calculation for 1 month of data just to show what would be the effect on final fluxes. Here you see the cumulative correction factors. It's quite different for different thresholds. But this doesn't necessarily mean the final cumulative fluxes will be affected in this way or in this magnitude. A colleague from Belgium is working on this topic now with the multi-site ICOS data to quantify the effect on the final fluxes. Their work is not published, but for one site, at least in Belgium, they found close to 10% deviation in final fluxes just because of this reason. But in general, I think it is clear that the noise removal procedure is causing uncertainty. Yeah, since the procedure is problematic, then the question is that how can we omit this step, or is it possible? Again, the current method that you see, this equation on the bottom left is fit to the noise-free gas spectra shown with black for the range highlighted here. And this range is also adjustable in EdiPro. In our paper, we simply added a noise term into the equation and fit that directly to the noise contaminated spectrum. And this updated equation is fitted to entire spectrum. This then eliminates all the shortcomings related to noise removal procedure and also subjectivity therein. And also you don't need to specify the range for response time fitting. This is also eliminated. And we tested this method for various attenuation and noise cases, but I will not go into details that much, but shortly it works without any problem. Now I will present 2 practical suggestions to improve the response time estimation in your data. First one is if you want to apply the noise removal procedure still. In this case, visual inspection is very important that you need to do for sure. So once you process the data, EdiPro saves the ensemble spectra under spectral assessment folder. And there are 2 files, and one for water vapor and the one for non-reactive gases, all CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and so on. And you can plot the ensemble spectra as you see, and decide which threshold would be better. And again, of course, this is subjective, but still better than using 1 Hertz default threshold. Let's say you thought that the 3 Hertz is a good choice for you. Then you come back to spectral assessment section in EdiPro and change this threshold here and reprocess your data. And another important thing to highlight here is that if you think the attenuation is very low in your data, and this is the case here actually, maybe it is better if you skip the noise removal procedure. So how to do it? So you can set the threshold bigger than 5 Hertz if you have 10 Hertz data sampling. Then basically you can skip this procedure. And the second suggestion, if you want to implement the new method that I presented, but this method is not available yet in the software, but there is a shortcut, you can still apply it. Here using the spectra I mentioned in those files, CSV files, by fitting the updated equation I showed, you can obtain the new response time or cutoff frequency for each gas. Then you come back to this file and make the necessary changes. This text file that you see on the right is a summary of all spectral assessment. Here, the FC is cutoff frequency shown for each gas. And of course, for water vapor, it is shown for different relative humidity cases. So simply update this info in the file and then save the file. Later come back to EditPro. In the spectral assessment section, select this option that I show with the arrow in there. This is spectral assessment file available for this dataset. Then simply upload this file here, and this is going to override all the assessment, and it is going to use the better response time estimated with the new method already, and then you get your data updated. Yeah, I know this sounds a bit complicated, but actually it is very easy. You should just do it once. But still, we are working on it to make it more simple. So in few weeks, we will provide a simple code in Zenodo to perform this procedure. So all you need to do is to select files in the folder, and it will estimate the response time and update the file automatically. And if you want to apply this method and have some questions, you can contact me. Happy to help. But for further details and other technical issues, you can check the paper. And lastly, about the alternatives, of course, these are not the only options you have. There are other alternatives available for spectral correction in different softwares. This EduH software developed in University of Helsinki, the response time is based on co-spectra. And this has its own advantages and disadvantages, so up to you to decide what to compromise here. There is also visualization tool in the software, and that is lacking in EditPro actually. And in EditForar, sorry, I have never used this thing, but there is also different method available in this software based on wavelet. And there is also another new method came out last year, but this new method is not available in any software for now. Yeah, but this is all I have for the talk. Thank you for the attention. And if there is time, maybe I can take some questions.
Wonderful. All right, thank you for that. Yes, lots of considerations with covariance data. Any quick questions here?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Toprak. And my question is that how you estimate time delay for the methane and NTO for the closed path? How you estimate the time delay between open path sonic anemometer and closed path methane and NTO gas analyze gas for the Tunker's data?
Yeah, okay, but this is not relevant to this process actually, but it will be relevant in the part one of this papers actually that we highlighted. So depending on which time lag correction method you use, there is also actually interaction between high frequency response correction and the time lag. But this is really another topic to maybe allocate another presentation fully.
Sure. Okay.
And I think you two have already connected, but the methane and N2O FLUXNet committee, I think that would be a really great place to connect and provide more resources for the community. So I think you guys have already been in touch. So yeah, it'll be great to revisit that at the committee.
Sure. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thanks for making that accessible and digestible with examples. Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. Ben, I'll have you go next. I'll get your talk.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Runkle. I'm a professor at the University of Arkansas, Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering. Been doing flex work for a while. And one of the, I guess the main thesis, the broader thesis and motivation for this talk is about how do we derive more information from our high frequency data than we currently get. We essentially digest 36,000 data points into 1/2 hour flux, and we're losing a lot in that process. And so this is a kind of call to think about what else can we derive from that. And I'll share work from our group and others on detecting ebullition for methane fluxes, but there's a lot of other products and processes out there for partitioning evaporation from transpiration, different ways to look at CO2 flux dynamics, some other processes around hotspot identification, and so on. So yeah, what can we pull out of these? I have some example time series traces here of the scalar data sets. So on the left here, you see in black is a methane time series over 30 minutes, and blue is the water vapor, and then green is the CO2 concentration time series. And you see in this case, the scalars are very similar. The methane and water vapor concentration time series look extremely parallel to each other. And the one beneath it, the carbon, is just a mirror image because this is a daytime case where the carbon is being taken up by the plants in photosynthesis. So you can see a lot of similarity between those terms. In some other cases, we still have, so this is one other 1/2 hour, we still have a lot of very clear similarity between the water vapor and CO2 flux, but there's some significant deviations from that similarity in the methane time series, that top trace, a lot of positive excursions above the kind of mean behavior that's there. And there's a lot of work being done to derive and basically say that that is the result of ebullition, a bubbling flux that's temporally intermittent from the surface of measurement. And so I wanted to show just, yeah, kind of quick schematic diagrams of some of the ways that we measure fluxes, look at the different transport pathways. You can see there's kind of 3 or 4 main transport pathways: diffusion out of the water surface or soil surface, plant-mediated transport. Those would be kind of combined in the tower's eye as kind of continuous moving processes that would kind of combine to look diffusive. And then we also have ebullition, which is a buildup of bubbles that then come up in random kind of or stochastic places around the field at different time points. And so the aim is to look at how can we more accurately detect them. When we're doing our different measurements, you have on the left a chamber system that you might have a small rapid increase in methane concentration that your flux processing scheme might call noise, or a poorly fit linear slope. So you throw away that data. You have a bubble trap that collects bubbles and diffusive methane, but probably is not able to get vegetative transport. Then you have these bubbles, which you may in the eddy covariance time series also, they might trigger some quality flag, and they might also be thrown away. So we're not necessarily able to capture all of these pathways really well through any one of the methods, but hopefully through some kind of cross collaboration between them, we'll be able to get some more information there. So why do we care about ebullition? It's challenging to get, and it would really help constrain the methane budget. I co-organized a session on methane flux at AGU, and half of the speakers say something about, oh, and then there's ebullition. You know, it's really difficult to get an accurate reading of something that's this sporadic in time and space. We have a site in our paper here that I'll talk about in a moment, that in different landscapes, ebullition can be between 1% and 90% of the methane flux. So it's a really unconstrained part of the methane budget. There's also evidence that it will preferentially increase above the other pathways in response to warming, as there's more methane bubble creation in bottom sediments that are then kind of coming up together. So we've looked at a recent paper from Japan, from Iwata et al., looking at ways to detect ebullition using the kind of graphics that I showed earlier. We tested in our paper, led by my current grad student, Will Richardson, and also in collaboration with Michelle Reba from the USDA, we looked at this method, looked at ways to increase its transferability in different landscapes. And we also looked at the landscape that we were looking at in rice, just to look at some of the mechanistic insight that we could gather about the emissions there. So how do they work? How does the method work to identify ebullition? It takes advantage of that scalar similarity. It does require some empirically derived parameters. And so far, at least when we were writing our paper, there wasn't a lot of cases of its use. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. There's also not yet a validation. So we can make an estimate of ebullition, but we don't have a concurrent bubble trap or some other approach to say that we're actually accurately estimating ebullition. We're kind of saying that that's what is the primary cause of those disturbances from the similarity theory. There are some other methods. This paper expanded on it, but took a different direction. It's a little bit more in the spatial dimension, spatial hotspots. That's much more common in a natural wetland where you have really different, zones of wetness or nutrient availability or vegetation cover. So we focused on the Iwata paper. We wanted to interrogate the method, look at how it worked in our system. We did a sensitivity analysis, and then we also looked at main drivers and mechanisms for the ebullition that we did detect in our rice system. We had our database or data set was on our 2 rice fields in Arkansas, big 26 hectare, 0 grade leveled production scale fields. This was data set from 2017 when they were both under a continuous flood irrigation. That's kind of very easy to create a lot of methane in that landscape. So it's a good test case scenario. The data processing, we used EdiPro to do basically all of the non-methane fluxes, some of the quality control terms, some pre-processing steps. And then we also used a code that was from that Japanese paper looking at that does a lot of the partition work. It separates out the total from the ebullitive and diffusant components. It uses a wavelet scheme, so that code runs the wavelets. There's also an R code that we put on top of that did some work with a random error estimation and some iteratively weighted least squares regression techniques. So those are then integrated to get this estimate. And I just kind of want to show, the method is based in this scalar similarity, and with the idea that ebullition is the primary reason that the scalar similarity is violated. And so we look at the case here or the more dramatic case I showed earlier and look at those deviations. So the method works by transforming the time series using wavelet coefficients or deriving wavelet coefficients, which is a way of essentially combining time and frequency information within the time series. So, you see the time series. If you go all the way to the frequency space, that's like a Fourier transform where you're picking out the frequencies that contain the most information. And a wavelet is kind of a middle ground where you're maintaining the time information, but also getting information on the frequency space. It's a time series technique. And the way that we analyzed the data is we took cases through visual inspection where we had what looked like highly ebullitive and then highly non-ebullitive cases. And we plotted the wavelet coefficients, and there's like probably too much for the 5 minutes or so that I have it. But on the left is so on this graph is the wavelet coefficients for methane on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, the 2 plots are the wavelet coefficients for water vapor and for CO2. So we're comparing it to both of those reference scalars, and then the color scheme there is by the frequency information associated with each of those coefficients. We can draw a line of regression through that, and then you have the red dashed lines, which are that's one of the empirical parameters, how wide across that regression. So basically within that regression, the fluxes are similar, and you would say that that's diffusive. And then anything outside of that, those coefficients relate to the ebullitive dynamics. And so I'll just kind of show a couple more examples here where we have a mixture and then a mostly diffusive flux. And so you can see in the mostly diffusive flux, most of the coefficients are clustered really closely around that regression line. You don't have a lot of deviation from that similarity like we did in the higher case. But there's a lot of empiricalness to how wide you draw those lines. We did some tests and we made some adjustments that made it, for example, sensitive to the amount of methane concentration variance across the time series. We also excluded more of the low frequency regimes because our imagination, our conceptual diagram of ebullition is that it's a high frequency process. Is a 5 or 10 minute ebullitive event isn't really something that we felt comfortable kind of claiming or capturing as ebullition. So we made some changes to the approach there. And kind of long story short, we looked at we did that for the 2 different fields over the course of the summer where the fields are flooded, and we could show that the methane ebullition proportion out of the total was about 10% on average, but it really marched up through the season from maybe 6, 7% early in the season, 7, 8, 9% in the middle, and then 10 to 13% at the end of the season. So we showed a kind of increase in the methane emissions there, and the ebullitive proportion of the methane emissions. And then we also did some look at what is driving the emissions, and we did a multilinear regression type assessment of the key variables coming in here. On the graph here on the right, we have on the top is the natural log of the total methane flux, and then the proportion, the ebullitive fraction of the total flux, and the y-axis is the percent of variance explained by the variables on the x-axis that are sensible heat flux, ecosystem respiration derived from the CO2 flux, air temperature, wind speed, and water table depth. And we found that ebullition was associated with upward sensible heat flux, so some movement in that direction due to the buoyancy flux, and then also reduced wind speed. So lower wind speeds probably are shutting off some of the plant-mediated transport or diffusion and increasing the rate of bubbling. We did not find, to our surprise, a clear role of air pressure. There's a lot of hypotheses about air pressure is like a weighted blanket you put on the surface and then it's removed, you can let things come out. We didn't really see, we looked at a couple different metrics of that, but I think there's more that we could pull out. We also saw, as I showed earlier, this increase in ebullition through the season that might be associated with increased bubble creation during the season or buildup of methane as the fields become more and more reduced. We also did some look at the diel or diurnal cycling of emissions, and that could relate to theories or hypotheses about contraction of the bubble pool in these different soil environments. So there's a lot of questions still kind of out there. The paper is there. Maybe I just lost my ability to advance. I don't know where the. Okay, so yeah, this is my last slide. So it's my kind of summative statements that we do still need independent validation of this. So we're looking for partners that could bring their bubble trap data, bring their high frequency chamber data sets, from which there are now also codes to pull out sudden rises in concentration that can be ascribed to ebullition, and partner that to concurrent eddy covariance measurements, and then see if they kind of handshake across those different scales. Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities with existing data sets. I think as more and more people are doing high frequency chamber measurements, we'd also like to do it with bubble traps in a variety of different landscapes. Then we could go back across all the 500 site years or whatever that we have and look at a global picture of what is the ebullitive flux and where is it and what are the driving factors and so on. I think there's a really interesting kind of science opportunity there. We'd also like to work to continue to make the software to do this more accessible and feasible. That is a mix of EddyPro and Fortran and R, and that's kind of inevitable when we're using these kinds of things. And like I said, to expand to more FLUXNet methane sites. We do have our code is on GitHub, and I think that the paper is actually 41 pages, so I'm sorry about that, but it is written in a kind of didactic manner, and I think that there's a lot of. We really try to walk you through how to perform this, and we are here to help. So my student Will and I are both really interested in this and thinking about ways to layer this onto an initiative like FLUXNet methane. It's an opportunity to pull more of that information out of the raw data time series. So that's all. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah.
A lot of exciting points to think about. Yeah, so I want to thank all of our speakers and everyone for attending this morning. We're going to take a break. We're going to reconvene at 1 p.m. Pacific time. So those of you who are online, will probably turn off the Zoom session for now, and then we can sign back in at 1. And this afternoon, we're going to hear one talk from June Skeeter, who's going to talk about ways of automating EddyPro. And so that talk will be recorded, and then we're going to jump into the data tutorials, and that's what we're going to focus on this afternoon and tomorrow. So again, we're going to repeat the data tutorials 3 times, so you can attend the one that best suits your schedule, and they will be recorded as well. So yeah, thanks again, and I'll see everyone this afternoon.